The autumn sun hung low over the Tucson horizon, casting long shadows across residential neighborhoods as families prepared dinner and children played their final games before bedtime. Emma Richardson stood at her kitchen sink, washing the dinner dishes with methodical precision, her mind already planning tomorrow's schedule. She had a presentation at work. Lily needed new shoes, and she'd promised to volunteer at the community center on Thursday. Emma was the kind of woman who made everything look effortless, perfect mother, dedicated professional, reliable friend. Her colleagues admired her work ethic. Her neighbors praised her parenting. Her family depended on her unwavering presence and care. At 34 years old, Emma had learned to compartmentalize the pain of her divorce from Daniel. Their marriage had deteriorated over 3 years, transforming from passionate love into bitter resentment. The custody battles had been vicious, each parent accusing the other of inadequacy and malice. Emma had one primary custody of Lily, but the legal war had left scars on everyone involved. Still, she carried on with the resilience that defined her character, determined that her daughter would grow up in a stable, loving environment despite the fractured family dynamics. That November evening felt unremarkable, ordinary in every way. Lily had eaten her dinner of chicken nuggets and apple slices, her small mouth forming a satisfied smile. After bath time, Emma had read 3 bedtime stories, tucked her daughter under the soft pink blanket, and kissed her forehead with a tenderness that only mothers truly understand. By 8 o'clock, Lily was asleep, and Emma had the evening to herself. She poured a glass of wine, settled onto the worn leather couch, and turned on her favorite television show. The house was quiet except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of neighborhood dogs. Everything was perfect. Everything was safe. At 8:47 p.m., Sarah Richardson received a concerning text message from her sister. Need to talk about something important regarding custody arrangements. Can you stop by tomorrow? Emma wanted legal advice before her next meeting with Daniel's lawyer. Sarah replied that she'd visit after work, around 5 o'clock. Nothing seemed unusual about the message. Emma often sought her sister's counsel regarding complex custody matters. The next morning, Sarah woke early and checked her phone. Emma hadn't responded to her evening message, but that wasn't alarming. Emma often worked early morning shifts and might still be sleeping. Sarah texted back, "See you around 5. Love you." She went about her day normally, running errands and attending meetings at her own job. But something kept nagging at the back of her mind, a vague feeling of unease that she couldn't quite articulate. When Sarah arrived at Emma's house at 5:15 p.m., something felt wrong immediately. The front door was slightly ajar, which was unusual. Emma was security conscious, always locking up meticulously. Sarah pushed the door open slowly, calling out her sister's name. "Emma, it's me, Sarah." Silence greeted her. As Sarah stepped inside, her stomach dropped. The living room was in disarray, furniture overturned, throw pillows scattered across the floor like debris from a storm. A lamp lay broken on its side, its bulb shattered, creating a spider web pattern of glass across the hardwood. Emma's reading glasses rested on the floor near the couch, one lens cracked. But what made Sarah's blood freeze was the sight of 3-year-old Lily sitting alone in the middle of the chaos, holding her worn stuffed rabbit, tears streaming down her small face. The little girl wasn't crying loudly. She was sitting in stunned silence, occasional whimpers escaping her throat, her eyes vacant and traumatized. "Lily, oh my God, Lily!" Sarah rushed to her niece, scooping her into her arms and holding her trembling body close. Lily didn't resist, but she didn't respond either. She simply stared straight ahead, her mind seemingly disconnected from her surroundings. Sarah's hands shook as she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. Her voice was barely steady as she reported to the dispatcher. "My sister is missing. I found her daughter alone. There are signs of struggle. I think something terrible has happened." Within minutes, sirens wailed through the quiet neighborhood. Police officers arrived first, securing the scene with professional efficiency. They guided Sarah and Lily to a safer area while they conducted a preliminary investigation. Detective arrived 20 minutes later, pulling up to the scene in his unmarked sedan. He had been with the Tucson Police Department for 28 years, and his instincts were honed by hundreds of cases. One look at the crime scene told him this wasn't a simple disappearance. The back door hung slightly ajar, cold evening air whistling through the gap. Approached it carefully, his detective's eye cataloging every detail. The lock around the doorknob showed clear signs of forced entry. Scratches around the mechanism indicated someone had it open with a tool. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't negligence. This was predatory and calculated. Walking through the house, documented everything. Emma's purse sat on the kitchen counter, exactly where she would have left it upon arriving home. Inside were her wallet, credit cards, and $73 in cash. No one fleeing voluntarily leaves money behind. Her cell phone rested beside the purse, the screen displaying unanswered text messages from work colleagues asking about a project deadline. Her car keys hung on the wall hook near the garage entrance. The vehicle remained parked in the garage, doors locked, showing no signs of recent use. In the kitchen, noticed something that made his jaw clench. Small handprints of blood, not from a major wound but significant enough to indicate violence, were smeared near the back door frame at waist height. Multiple prints suggested a struggle, someone trying to grab or hold onto something as they were being pulled. The kitchen showed other signs of violence. A vase overturned on the counter, flowers wilted and water spilled across the tile, a chair knocked backward near the dining table. Instinct screamed that Emma had been taken forcibly from her home. This was no accident, no voluntary disappearance, no simple family dispute. This was an abduction, potentially a violent one. The questions in his mind: who had taken her? Why? Was she still alive? How much time had elapsed since her disappearance? Every minute that passed decreased the likelihood of finding her unharmed. The detective turned his attention to Lily, who was now wrapped in a blanket provided by a patrol officer. The little girl remained silent, her eyes glassy and distant. She had witnessed something traumatic, something that had fractured her young mind's ability to process reality. As knelt down to her level, Lily didn't make eye contact. She simply stared at nothing, occasionally whimpering softly, her small body trembling despite the blanket. Knew that whatever Lily had seen would be crucial to solving this case. She was the only living witness. But right now, she was too traumatized to communicate coherently. Child psychologists would need to be involved carefully, without leading questions or suggestions that might implant false memories. As darkness fell completely over the neighborhood, police cars lined the street with their lights flashing. The sound of the crime scene investigation was already evidence technicians photographing, measuring, collecting samples. Within hours, the news media would descend like vultures, broadcasting Emma's face across every news station in Arizona. Within days, search parties would comb through desert terrain and wooded areas. But in this moment, as detective stood in Emma Richardson's ransacked living room, he knew he was facing one of the most critical investigations of his career. Somewhere out there, Emma was either hiding, running, or in grave danger, and the only person who could tell him which was a 3-year-old girl too traumatized to speak. The interrogation room at the Tucson Police Department was deliberately designed to induce psychological pressure. Gray concrete walls, a single metal table bolted to the floor, two hard plastic chairs facing each other across the cold surface, and a mirror that everyone knew was actually a window for observers. The fluorescent lights hummed with an almost sinister monotony, casting everything in a harsh, unflattering glow. Detective sat across from Daniel Richardson, a legal pad in front of him, a pen poised in his hand. Daniel's lawyer, a court-appointed public defender named Summers, sat rigidly beside her client, her expression carefully neutral. Daniel Richardson looked exactly like what the detective's gut told him he was: guilty. The man's hands trembled on the metal table, leaving small sweat marks on the cold surface. He ran his fingers through his dark hair repeatedly, a nervous habit that betrayed his anxiety. His left leg bounced incessantly under the table, creating a rhythmic tapping that echoed slightly in the confined space. His eyes darted between and his lawyer, never meeting either gaze directly, never establishing the confident eye contact of an innocent person. Had conducted hundreds of interrogations throughout his career, and he trusted his instincts. 30 years of experience had taught him to read body language, to interpret the microexpressions that revealed truth or deception. Everything about Daniel screamed guilt. The investigation into Daniel Richardson had been swift and efficient. Within hours of Emma's disappearance being reported, police had identified him as a person of interest based on their extensive documented history of domestic conflict. Their divorce proceedings had been acrimonious and brutal, playing out in courtrooms and through angry exchanges of legal motions. Neighbors had reported hearing violent arguments from their home, shouting, accusations, the unmistakable sounds of physical confrontation. Police had been called to their residence 7 times over the course of their marriage, each time documenting escalating hostility and mutual accusations of abuse. Daniel had been arrested twice. The first incident occurred 18 months ago when he'd shown up at Emma's workplace, drunk and angry, demanding to see her. He'd caused such a scene that security had forcibly removed him from the building. The second arrest came just 8 months prior when he'd violated a restraining order Emma had obtained, appearing at her home and refusing to leave until police arrived. He'd been arrested for violation of a protection order, served 45 days in county jail, and completed a court-mandated anger management program. Though according to reports, his completion was perfunctory at best. The custody battle had been particularly vicious. Daniel had demanded 50-50 custody of Lily, but the courts had granted Emma primary custody due to Daniel's documented history of anger issues and substance abuse. He'd failed 3 drug tests, testing positive for cocaine and methamphetamine. His visitation rights had been limited to supervised sessions, which infuriated him. He'd filed multiple appeals, hired expensive lawyers, and made numerous court appearances, each one filled with hostile accusations and barely contained rage. Emma had expressed genuine fear of Daniel to her therapist, worry that his instability and access to firearms posed a genuine threat to her and Lily's safety. So when Emma disappeared, the logical conclusion seemed obvious to everyone involved. Daniel had finally snapped. His rage, simmering beneath the surface for years, had erupted into violence. The domestic abuse patterns that characterized their relationship had escalated from emotional and psychological abuse to physical violence and, possibly, murder. "Walk me through your evening," Daniel said, his voice calm and measured, the tone of someone speaking to someone he'd already determined was guilty. "Take your time. Tell me everything you did from 6 o'clock onwards." Daniel swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "I was at my apartment, alone. I watched television and had some dinner." "What did you watch?" pressed, his pen ready to write. I don't really remember. Some sports program, I think, maybe a movie. I wasn't paying close attention, Daniel stammered. You don't remember what you were watching on the night your ex-girlfriend disappeared. That's convenient, said, his tone shifting to one of skeptical accusation. Daniel, you're not making this easier on yourself. Tell me the truth. I am telling the truth. I was home alone. Daniel's voice rose in pitch, desperation creeping into his words. Summers placed a restraining hand on Daniel's arm. My client has answered your question. Without corroborating evidence, we're finished here. But leaned forward, his eyes intense. Daniel, we've spoken to your neighbors. One of them says they saw your truck near Emma's neighborhood around the time of the disappearance. How do you explain that? This was slightly misleading. The neighbor had actually seen a truck that resembled Daniel's, but was employing a common interrogation tactic, presenting speculation as fact to gauge Daniel's reaction. Daniel's face went pale, his entire body tensing. That's not possible. I wasn't there. I swear I wasn't there, Daniel protested. Your phone records tell a different story, continued, another tactical exaggeration. They hadn't yet received the detailed cell phone records, but they were in the process of obtaining them. Daniel didn't know this. Daniel's hands gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. I want a lawyer. I'm not saying anything else without my lawyer present. Summers nodded. Detective, my client has invoked his right to counsel. This interrogation is over. Smiled slightly, a cold expression that suggested he'd already secured his conviction in his mind. He stood, gathering his legal pad. We'll talk again, Daniel. And when we do, you might want to reconsider your story. Outside the interrogation room, Detective briefed the prosecutor's office via video call. Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Martinez listened intently, her expression growing more convinced with each detail presented. By the end of the briefing, Martinez was already drafting preliminary charges. We'll proceed with kidnapping charges, possibly escalate to murder if we don't find her alive, Martinez said decisively. What's your timeline for an arrest? We're gathering additional evidence now. I want to solidify the case before we formally charge him, but I'm confident we have our perpetrator, replied with certainty. Meanwhile, the media had already gotten wind of the investigation's direction. Anonymous sources within the police department, officers who had worked the domestic violence calls between Daniel and Emma, had leaked information to local news stations. Within hours, Daniels from his previous arrest was being broadcast across every television channel in Arizona. News anchors spoke gravely about a Tucson man arrested in connection with the disappearance of a local mother, showing footage of Emma's home cordoned off with police tape, interviews with concerned neighbors, and photographs of Daniel looking angry and disheveled. By evening, social media had erupted. Internet vigilantes began researching Daniel's history, compiling his arrest records, his failed drug tests, his restraining order violations. Websites published his photograph, his address, his employment information. Angry citizens gathered with handmade protest signs outside police headquarters, demanding immediate arrest and maximum penalties. Some particularly vocal activists camped outside Daniel's apartment building, ensuring he couldn't leave without confrontation. Daniel's lawyer filed multiple motions requesting his release on bail, but the judge, swayed by public sentiment and the apparent strength of the circumstantial evidence, bailed repeatedly. Daniel remained in custody, held without bond, awaiting formal charges. His reputation was destroyed before he'd ever stepped foot in a courtroom. In the holding cells, other inmates recognized him from the news coverage. Daniel endured verbal abuse, threats, and intimidation from fellow prisoners. Prison guards maintained order but offered little protection from the psychological torment of being labeled a child abuser and wife killer by the entire prison population. Back in his office, Detective felt satisfied. The case was coming together. The evidence seemed solid. Daniel had motive, opportunity, and a documented history of violence. The public was already convinced of his guilt. The prosecution had enough to move forward with formal charges. Within weeks, believed they'd have a conviction. What Detective didn't realize was that he was completely, catastrophically wrong. He'd fallen into one of law enforcement's most dangerous traps, confirmation bias. Once he'd identified Daniel as the suspect, every piece of evidence seemed to confirm his guilt. Any contradictory information was dismissed or reinterpreted. The real perpetrator was walking free while an innocent man sat in a cell, watching his life disintegrate. Dr. Hayes sat across from Lily Richardson in a deliberately designed child-friendly room at the Tucson Children's Advocacy Center. The space was nothing like the cold, institutional interrogation rooms where adults were questioned. Instead, soft pastel colors adorned the walls, gentle blues, warm yellows, calming greens. Stuffed animals occupied shelves, their button eyes seeming to watch with gentle compassion. A small wooden table held coloring books, crayons, and simple puzzles. One corner contained a playhouse where children could retreat into imaginative safety. Soft instrumental music played at low volume from hidden speakers, designed to soothe rather than interrogate. Dr. Hayes was a child psychologist with 15 years of experience interviewing traumatized children. She understood the fragile nature of young minds, particularly those who had witnessed violence or loss. She knew that leading questions could implant false memories, that suggestive language could shape narratives, That aggressive questioning could cause psychological harm that lasted decades. The goal wasn't to extract information at any cost. It was to gently coax truth from a child while causing minimal additional trauma. Lily sat beside her, still clutching the worn stuffed rabbit that had become her security blanket. The little girl wore a pink dress that Sarah had selected from Emma's closet, something that smelled like her mother. Lily's eyes were vacant, her expression frozen somewhere between confusion and despair. She hadn't spoken meaningful words in 3 days. She ate when food was placed in front of her. She slept fitfully, often waking with night terrors that left her screaming in Sarah's arms. She used the bathroom when prompted, but she didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't engage with the world around her. "Hello, Lily," Dr. Hayes said softly, her voice deliberately gentle and non-threatening. I'm here to listen to you. There's no pressure to talk about anything you don't want to talk about. We can just sit together, okay?" Lily didn't respond. She stared at the stuffed rabbit's fuzzy ear, her small fingers absently stroking its worn fabric. Dr. Hayes didn't push. She simply sat quietly for several minutes, occasionally glancing at Lily with compassionate eyes, allowing the child to acclimate to her presence. Sometimes the most powerful intervention was simply sitting with someone in their pain without demanding they process it or explain it. After a comfortable silence, Dr. Hayes picked up a coloring book and some crayons. "I really like to color sometimes. Do you like to color, Lily?" Still no response. But Lily's eyes briefly tracked the movement as Dr. Hayes opened the coloring book and began adding color to a simple drawing of a butterfly. The psychologist worked silently, making deliberate, gentle strokes with the crayons, creating no pressure, simply modeling an activity. After several minutes, Dr. Hayes slid the coloring book slightly toward Lily, positioning a purple crayon near her small hand, not demanding participation, simply offering the opportunity. To her surprise, Lily's tiny fingers reached out. She grasped the crayon with uncertain grip and began making small marks on the page. It was the first voluntary action the child had taken toward any adult since her mother's disappearance. Over the following weeks, sessions with Dr. Hayes became Lily's anchors in a sea of chaos and loss. The psychologist never asked direct questions about what happened. Instead, she employed indirect techniques: drawing, play, storytelling with puppets, observations about feelings and emotions. Gradually, painfully slowly, Lily began to respond with single words: sad, scared, mommy. One particularly significant session occurred when Dr. Hayes introduced story puppets, one representing a mother figure, another a child. She began creating a narrative about a child feeling confused and scared, allowing the puppet to express emotions without any connection to Emma's case. Lily watched intently, and eventually, tentatively, began manipulating her own puppet, making it cry and hide. "Your puppet seems very scared," Dr. Hayes observed neutrally, avoiding leading language. "That's okay. It's safe to feel scared here." Lily made her puppet hide under an imaginary blanket. "Sometimes when we're scared, we hide," Dr. Hayes continued. "And sometimes when we're ready, we can talk about what scared us. Not today if you're not ready, but whenever you are." The investigation into Daniel Richardson proceeded while Lily struggled to process her trauma. Detective visited Dr. Hayes regularly, asking if the child had provided any useful information. Wanted details. Where had Emma gone? What had Daniel said? Had Emma been hurt? But Dr. Hayes maintained strict ethical boundaries. "Lily is a traumatized child, not a tool for investigation," she explained firmly too. "Pressuring her to provide testimony before she's psychologically ready could cause permanent damage and also contaminate any evidence she might eventually provide. We need to move at her pace." Was frustrated by this cautious approach. As weeks passed with no breakthrough, the detective felt mounting pressure. The prosecutor's office wanted movement on the case. The media demanded updates. The public wanted justice. Daniel Richardson sat in jail awaiting trial, his conviction seeming inevitable based on circumstantial evidence. Yet the key witness, the only person who had actually seen what happened, remained mute. In her private sessions, Dr. Hayes documented meticulous notes about Lily's gradual emotional progress. The child was beginning to trust again, to engage with the world, to express basic needs and emotions. But the traumatic memory of whatever she'd witnessed remained locked away, protected by her mind's survival mechanism. Forcing that door open prematurely could shatter her developing psyche. Sarah Richardson, Emma's sister, became Lily's primary caregiver. She'd taken a leave of absence from her job to provide the constant emotional support Lily desperately needed. The two of them moved through days with quiet routine: breakfast, coloring time, trips to the park where Lily could run and burn off some of the anxiety coursing through her young body. Sarah read bedtime stories, held her niece during nightmares, whispered reassurances into the darkness. But Sarah struggled too. She grieved her missing sister while caring for her traumatized niece. She attended legal proceedings that seemed to move with painful slowness. She witnessed Daniel Richardson's public crucifixion in the media and courtroom, wondered if justice was being served or if something was terribly wrong. She spoke with prosecutors who seemed so confident in their case, so certain of Daniel's guilt. Yet Sarah couldn't shake a growing doubt. She didn't know what had happened to Emma, but something about the narrative didn't feel complete. 3 months after Emma's disappearance, Detective attended another session with Dr. Hayes and Lily. He sat behind one-way glass, watching the child interact with the psychologist. Lily was drawing now, creating colorful pictures of flowers and butterflies and suns. She occasionally spoke in single words or short phrases. Dr. Hayes had made genuine progress with the traumatized child. But the investigation was stalling. Without Lily's testimony, the case against Daniel Richardson relied entirely on circumstantial evidence. The history of violence, the weak alibi, the neighbor's uncertain sighting of a truck. A competent defense attorney would dismantle this case in trial. Knew they needed something more concrete. In his frustration, began considering unconventional approaches. He'd read about cases where sensory stimuli had triggered memories in traumatized individuals. He'd heard anecdotal evidence of animals helping people access emotional memories. He had an idea, controversial, possibly unethical, but potentially breakthrough. What if he brought Max, the department's legendary police dog, to interact with Lily? What if the familiar presence of an animal could trigger associations, could unlock memories trapped behind psychological walls? His colleagues thought he was insane. His supervisor warned against it. Child advocacy experts would definitely object, but Detective was desperate. As Daniel Richardson awaited trial for a crime believed he'd committed, and with Emma Richardson still missing and presumed dead, was willing to take risks. He just needed one breakthrough. He just needed Lily to remember. Detective stood in the police station's administrative office, facing a tribunal of disapproving faces. Police Captain Richard sat behind his desk, his expression stern and unyielding. Next to him was Lieutenant, head of the K-9 unit, her arms crossed defensively across her chest. Dr. Hayes sat in the third chair, her body language communicating profound skepticism about what was proposing. "You want to do what?" Captain's voice carried a mixture of disbelief and irritation. "You want to bring a 3-year-old traumatized child face to face with a police dog to see if it triggers memories. Do you understand how that sounds?" Had anticipated this resistance. He'd prepared arguments, research studies, case precedents. He knew he was proposing something unorthodox, potentially unethical by strict standards, but he also knew that conventional approaches were failing. The investigation had hit a wall. Daniel Richardson's trial date was approaching. The prosecutor's case was built on circumstantial evidence that a good defense attorney would shred, and the only living witness to whatever had happened in Emma Richardson's home remained psychologically locked down. "Captain, I've reviewed documented cases where sensory triggers have unlocked memories in trauma victims," began, pulling out a folder containing printed articles and case studies. "There's significant research on how animals, particularly dogs, can facilitate emotional access. In one case from 2015, a child who witnessed a car accident couldn't recall details despite extensive interviewing. When she was exposed to a dog similar to one she'd seen at the accident scene, her memories, suddenly became accessible. Dr. Hayes shook her head firmly. Detective, those studies involve willing participants, often adults. This is a 3-year-old child who is already severely traumatized. Exposing her to a large police dog without proper psychological preparation could cause additional trauma that might prevent her from ever testifying reliably. With all respect, Dr. Hayes, we're running out of time, countered, his frustration evident. Daniel Richardson's trial is scheduled for 6 weeks from now. We have circumstantial evidence at best. We need something concrete. Lily is our only witness. If she doesn't provide testimony, or at least give us direction, an innocent man might go free, or a guilty man might escape on a technicality. Phrasing "an innocent man might go free" revealed his unshakable conviction that Daniel was guilty, but genuinely believed this. After weeks of investigation, after reviewing all the evidence, after seeing Daniel's violent history, after witnessing his nervous demeanor in interrogation, was certain of Daniel's guilt. The problem was proving it beyond reasonable doubt. Lieutenant leaned forward. I'll allow Max to participate in this, but only under strict conditions. Max is a trained police dog with excellent behavioral control. He's not aggressive with children, but I want a veterinary behaviorist present, and I want the ability to terminate the interaction immediately if the dog shows any concerning behavior or if the child becomes excessively distressed. Agreed, said quickly, sensing an opening. Captain remained skeptical, but he recognized that refusing's request outright would simply delay the inevitable. If was determined to pursue this avenue, and he was clearly determined, it was better to maintain some level of oversight than to have him operating outside official channels. This session is off the record, stated firmly. If anything goes wrong, if anyone finds out we subjected a traumatized child to this kind of exposure, this department's liability is astronomical. Dr. Hayes, you need to be present to ensure Lily's is prioritized above the investigation. I will be observing and ready to intervene at any sign of distress, Dr. Hayes confirmed, though her tone remained disapproving. The meeting was scheduled for January 15th, 3 months after Emma's disappearance. It was held in a secure, temperature-controlled room in the basement of the police station, a space typically used for evidence storage, hastily cleaned and arranged for this unusual purpose. The walls were plain concrete, painted a neutral beige. A single window was covered with opaque blinds to prevent curious officers from observing. Dr. Hayes had the room decorated with soft blankets, toys, and Lily's stuffed rabbit, attempting to create a safe environment from what she anticipated would be an anxiety-inducing experience. Sarah arrived at the police station with Lily at 10 a.m., having been told only that there was a therapeutic exercise that might help Lily. Sarah wasn't informed about the police dog. Neither was Lily. When Sarah learned about the plan in the hallway outside the secure room, her face flushed with anger. "You didn't tell me about this," she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "You can't just expose her to a police dog without warning." "We wanted to see her natural reaction without preconditioning," Dr. Hayes explained gently. "Sarah, I understand your concerns, but I genuinely believe this might help Lily, and I will terminate the interaction immediately if she becomes too distressed." Sarah wanted to refuse to take Lily and leave, to protect her niece from any further trauma. But she also understood that Lily's testimony might be crucial to ensuring justice for Emma. If this unconventional approach could help unlock Lily's memories, didn't they have a moral obligation to try? The uncertainty paralyzed her. Finally, reluctantly, she agreed. Detective waited in an adjacent observation room, watching through a hidden camera feed. Lieutenant stood in the secure room with Max, the German shepherd's leash held firmly in her hand. Max was an impressive animal, a purebred German shepherd with a gleaming coat, intelligent brown eyes, and the bearing of a professional working dog. He'd been trained to detect narcotics and explosives with remarkable accuracy. His service record included dozens of major drug busts and bomb prevention operations. But he'd never been involved in anything like this before. When Lily entered the room holding Dr. Hayes' hand, her immediate reaction was fear. She pulled back, her small body tensing, her eyes widening at the sight of the large dog. For a moment, it seemed like the entire exercise would be a disaster. Lily was clearly terrified. "This is Max," Dr. Hayes said softly. "He's a friendly dog. He's here to say hello. You don't have to pet him or get close if you don't want to. We can just sit here and look at him for a little bit." They sat on the floor several feet from where stood with Max. For several minutes nothing happened. Lily remained tense, her eyes tracking Max's every movement, her fingers gripping the stuffed rabbit with white-knuckled intensity. Max, however, was displaying unusual behavior. The dog's nose was twitching, his ears alert, his entire body focused on something in the corner of the room, an evidence bag that had been inadvertently left behind during the room's preparation. That evidence bag contained fabric samples collected from Emma Richardson's home. The samples bore trace residues of various substances, including an industrial solvent used in maintenance and cleaning products. Max's training had taught him to alert strongly to specific compounds. While he was primarily trained to detect drugs and explosives, the industrial solvent in that evidence bag contained aromatic compounds that triggered his alert response. The dog suddenly became intensely focused, his entire body stiffening with concentration. He began straining against his leash, his nose working overtime, trying to approach the evidence bag. In the observation room, Detective leaned forward, intensely interested in this unexpected behavior. "What's in that bag?" he asked into a radio. "Evidence samples from the Richardson home," came the response from another officer monitoring the scene. His mind raced. Why was Max so intensely interested in those samples? What was triggering such a strong alert response? The dog's behavior was unusual, particularly given that Max should only be alert to explosives or narcotics. Unless. And then something remarkable happened. As Max strained toward the evidence bag, clearly agitated and focused, Lily's demeanor suddenly shifted. Her paralysis broke. Her eyes, which had been frozen in fear, suddenly came alive with recognition. Her small mouth opened and words emerged, the first coherent words she'd spoken in 3 months. "Bad man," she whispered, her voice barely audible but crystal clear. The simple two-word phrase hung in the air like an explosion. In the observation room, Detective felt his entire understanding of the case shift. Lily wasn't identifying her father. Her expression, her body language, her tone, everything indicated she was identifying someone else, someone she associated with bad. The pieces began rearranging themselves in his mind, but he didn't yet understand the new pattern they were forming. What he did understand was that his investigation had just taken an unexpected turn. Everything they'd built against Daniel Richardson suddenly felt fragile, potentially built on faulty foundations. As Lily began to cry softly, Dr. Hayes immediately scooped her into her arms, signaling for and Max to leave the room. The intervention was over. What remained was the crucial question. Who was the bad man that Lily had identified? The observation room fell into stunned silence. Detective replayed the video footage multiple times, watching Lily's lips form those two devastating words, "bad man." His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his radio to contact Captain. In that moment, the entire investigation pivoted on its axis. Everything had believed, every conclusion he'd reached, every statement he'd made to prosecutors and the media, all of it was potentially compromised by this simple phrase from a traumatized child. "Captain, we need to meet immediately in my office," said into the radio, his voice tight with controlled urgency. 20 minutes later, sat across from Captain Lieutenant Dr. Hayes and Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Martinez, the prosecutor who'd been building the case against Daniel Richardson. The video of Lily speaking played on a wall-mounted screen, the two words repeated several times as analyzed them frame by frame. "She's clearly identifying someone else," Dr. Hayes stated firmly. "Her body language, her facial expression, her tone, nothing about this suggests she's talking about her father. She's describing someone as bad." Jennifer Martinez looked profoundly uncomfortable. "This doesn't prove anything conclusively. A 2-year-old's identification is not reliable testimony. She could be referring to anyone, a stranger, an acquaintance, even someone from television or a story. "She's 3 years old," Dr. Hayes corrected sharply, and her identification was spontaneous, unprompted, and emotionally authentic. The question is, who is the bad man she's identifying? Pulled out a file containing photographs and background information he'd been compiling throughout the investigation. "We need to systematically review everyone with access to Emma's home: maintenance workers, contractors, delivery personnel, family friends." Someone triggered a strong enough memory that Lily spoke after 3 months of silence. Over the next 6 hours, team meticulously reviewed security footage from Emma's neighborhood. They interviewed neighbors more thoroughly, asking not about Daniel Richardson, but about any other suspicious persons they'd observed. They gathered maintenance records for Emma's home dating back 2 years. They reviewed delivery logs, service appointments, and work orders. The investigation took a crucial turn when they discovered that a maintenance company called Precision Building Services had serviced Emma's home regularly over the past 18 months. The work orders indicated that various tasks had been completed: HVAC maintenance, plumbing repairs, electrical inspections. One name appeared repeatedly on these work orders: Cole. When detectives pulled Cole's employee file, they discovered his photograph, felt his stomach tighten. Cole was a thin, wiry man in his early 40s with cold, calculating eyes that seemed to lack warmth or empathy. More significantly, they discovered his criminal history. Cole had been arrested 5 years prior for sexual assault and battery. He'd served 30 months in prison before being released on probation. His assault victim had been a woman who'd rejected his romantic advances. During the assault, he'd become violent when she refused him, resulting in serious injuries. Upon his release from prison, Cole had been mandated to complete anger management and sex offender rehabilitation programs. His parole officer noted that Cole displayed poor impulse control and harbored significant resentment toward women, particularly those he perceived as rejecting or humiliating him. His team discovered something even more disturbing: multiple witness statements indicating that Cole had developed an obsessive fixation on Emma Richardson. Neighbors reported seeing Cole's maintenance van parked outside Emma's home on several occasions when no work orders had been scheduled. One neighbor mentioned overhearing Cole asking Emma out repeatedly during routine maintenance visits, his requests becoming increasingly inappropriate despite Emma's consistent rejections. Emma had even filed a complaint with Cole's employer about his unwanted advances. "He became obsessed with her," stated, his voice heavy with the realization of how badly they'd misfocused their investigation. When she rejected him, when she complained about his behavior, It triggered his rage response, the same pattern that got him imprisoned 5 years ago. The timeline was meticulously reconstructed. Security footage from a neighbor's house camera showed Cole's van parked 3 houses away from Emma's residence on the night of her disappearance. The timing aligned perfectly with Emma's estimated time of death. Cell phone records placed Cole's phone at a remote location, 40 miles outside Tucson, approximately 45 minutes after Emma's disappearance. Location data that would later prove crucial to his prosecution. Personally reviewed the evidence bag that had triggered Max's alert response. The industrial solvent residue matched products used by Precision Building Services in their maintenance operations. Max hadn't been alerting to explosives or narcotics. The dog had been alerting to the distinctive chemical compounds that Cole used in his job, compounds that had transferred to evidence at the crime scene during the struggle with Emma. Lily associated that smell with the man who terrified her, Dr. Hayes explained. The olfactory memory, the sense of smell, is the most primitive and emotionally connected sense in the human brain. Even very young children retain olfactory memories far longer than visual memories. When Lily encountered that particular scent again, it triggered her memory of the traumatic event. Detective felt a sickening mixture of emotions, relief that they'd apparently found the true perpetrator, but also profound guilt and shame about their mishandling of the investigation. An innocent man sat in jail awaiting trial. His reputation was destroyed. His relationship with his daughter was fractured by circumstances beyond his control. And all because had fallen victim to confirmation bias, had allowed Daniel's documented history of domestic violence to narrow his investigative vision, had stopped looking beyond the most obvious suspect. The investigation into Cole revealed a deeply disturbing pattern of behavior. Cole had maintained meticulous records in a hidden journal discovered during his apartment search. The journal contained detailed observations about Emma, what she wore, when she arrived home from work, her daily routines, the times Lily attended preschool. Cole had fantasized about Emma for months, his entries growing increasingly disturbing and violent as Emma continued rejecting his advances. One particularly chilling entry, dated just days before Emma's disappearance, read, "She thinks she's too good for me. She'll see. She'll learn what it means to disrespect Cole. Nobody makes a fool of me." Additional evidence emerged. Forensic analysis of Cole's van revealed microscopic fibers matching Emma's clothing. Blood samples found on Cole's work boots matched Emma's DNA. Most damningly, investigators discovered that Cole had searched for information online about disposing of bodies in remote desert locations. He'd researched specific mining operations and abandoned mine shafts in the Arizona wilderness. As this evidence accumulated, realized with horror the magnitude of their investigative failure. They'd had the wrong man, completely, catastrophically wrong. And while they'd been building a case against Daniel Richardson based on domestic violence patterns and circumstantial evidence, the real predator had been hiding in plain sight, a maintenance worker with a criminal history of violence against women, a man with immediate access to Emma's home, a man whose obsession had metastasized into murderous rage. Personally went to Daniel Richardson's holding cell to inform him that the investigation was being redirected. Daniel's face cycled through confusion, relief, anger, and ultimately, despair. The despair of someone who understood that his life had been irrevocably damaged by a system that had failed him. "I'm sorry," said, the words feeling inadequate and hollow. "We made a terrible mistake." Daniel Richardson didn't respond. He simply turned away, his back to the detective, his shoulders trembling with emotions too complex and overwhelming to articulate. The arrest warrant for Cole was issued within hours. By evening, Cole had been apprehended at a truck stop near the New Mexico border, apparently attempting to flee. When arrested, he displayed no surprise, no resistance. He simply smiled, a cold, unsettling expression that revealed nothing of his internal state. As drove home that evening, his mind was already racing ahead to the interrogation. He needed to break Cole, needed to understand his motivation, needed to locate Emma's body. But he also carried the crushing weight of his investigative failure, the knowledge that he'd nearly convicted an innocent man, while the real killer escaped justice through sheer blind luck, or rather, through the two-word identification of a brave 3-year-old girl who, in her trauma and fear, had somehow found the courage to speak the truth. Cole sat in the same interrogation room where Daniel Richardson had been questioned weeks earlier. The gray walls seemed to close in around him, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across his angular face. Detective sat across from Cole, a legal pad before him, his expression carefully neutral despite the churning emotions beneath the surface. Cole's attorney, a public defender named Finch, sat beside his client, his body language suggesting he already knew his client was guilty and that this interrogation was merely a formality. Cole was different from Daniel Richardson. Where Daniel had been nervous and defensive, Cole was eerily calm. He sat with perfect posture, his hands folded on the table, his cold eyes fixed on with an intensity that made the detective's skin crawl. There was something fundamentally wrong about this man, an absence of normal human affect, an emotional flatness that suggested his internal wiring had been damaged or never properly developed. "Mr. Cole, we have substantial evidence connecting you to Emma Richardson's disappearance," began, his voice measured and professional. "I want to give you the opportunity to explain your version of events. I'm recording this conversation and your attorney is present. Do you understand your rights?" "I understand," Cole replied, his voice devoid of inflection. He could have been discussing the weather. Laid out the evidence methodically. The security footage placing Cole's van near Emma's home. The cell phone data. The forensic evidence. The fibers, the blood, the microscopic residue from his work equipment found at the crime scene. Cole listened without reaction, his expression unchanged. "We found your journal," continued, sliding photographs of journal entries across the table. Cole's intimate thoughts, his obsessive fantasies about Emma, his escalating rage at her rejection. "You documented your obsession in detail. You researched how to dispose of a body. You searched for remote locations where you could hide a victim." Still no reaction from Cole. It was as though the detective was discussing a stranger's crimes, not his own. "Why don't you tell me what happened that night?" asked, his tone shifting to a more collaborative approach. Sometimes allowing suspects to narrate their own story in their own words revealed details that direct questioning might not uncover. Cole took a long, deliberate breath. When he began speaking, his voice remained flat and emotionless, as though he were reciting a grocery list rather than confessing to murder. "I'd been thinking about Emma for a long time," Cole said. "She was beautiful, elegant, different from other women. I knew she needed me, even if she didn't realize it yet. I'd tried to tell her how I felt, but she didn't understand. She thought she was too good for me. She acted like I was beneath her." Listened, documenting everything, understanding that Cole was rationalizing his behavior, reframing his obsession as something romantic rather than pathological. "I went to her house that evening," Cole continued. "I knew she was home. I'd been watching her schedule. I wanted to talk to her properly without the distractions of work. I wanted her to understand that we were meant to be together. I used the key code from the back gate. The maintenance company has access to all the entry points. I came in through the back door." Cole paused, his eyes distant as though remembering a pleasurable moment. "She was surprised to see me. When I explained that I'd come to finally express my true feelings, she laughed at me. She actually laughed. She said I was pathetic, that she would never be interested in someone like me, that I was beneath her notice. She threatened to report me to my employer, to call the police, to get a restraining order." Felt his jaw tighten. He understood that Cole had interpreted Emma's justifiable rejection and self-protection as a profound humiliation. "That's when something inside me broke," Cole said, his voice still remarkably calm. "She had no right to reject me, no right to humiliate me. I reached out to grab her arm to make her listen to me, but she pulled away. She screamed. She tried to run toward the phone. I lost control." "What did you do?" prompted, his voice steady despite the horror of what was coming. I hit her, Cole said flatly. I hit her harder than I intended. She fell. Her head struck the counter. There was blood, a lot of blood. I thought she was dead. I stood there for several minutes just staring at her body, understanding that everything was over, that my life was finished. Prison, that was my future. Cole's confession was methodical, devoid of remorse or emotional connection to the violence he described. He could have been describing watching paint dry. I panicked, Cole continued. I had to hide the body. I couldn't leave her there for her sister to find. I couldn't let anyone know what I'd done. I wrapped her in a tarp from my van. I used tarps for various maintenance jobs. I carried her to my vehicle. The child was asleep upstairs. She never saw me. I left her there. Felt profound revulsion at Cole's callousness. Emma had been a person, a mother, a daughter, a sister, a friend. To Cole, she was simply an obstacle that needed to be hidden, a consequence to be managed. "Where did you take her?" asked, his voice tight. "There's an abandoned mine shaft approximately 40 miles northeast of the city," Cole said. "I'd researched the location extensively. I knew it was isolated, unlikely to be discovered. I drove out there that night. I descended into the shaft and placed her body deep within the mine. I covered her with debris and rock. I believed she would never be found." The confession continued for another 2 hours. Cole provided precise details about his actions, his movements, the specific location where he disposed of Emma's body. He described the mine shaft's location with enough specificity that investigators could pinpoint it. He explained his thought process, not out of remorse, but with the clinical precision of someone discussing a problem that had been solved. When asked about his emotions, Cole's responses were disturbing in their lack of authentic feeling. "I don't feel regret," Cole stated matter-of-factly. "I feel irritation that my plan didn't work perfectly. I feel annoyance that law enforcement was able to identify me. I feel frustration that I'm now facing incarceration. But I don't feel remorse for Emma's death. She made her choice when she humiliated me. She accepted the consequences of that choice." Finch, Cole's attorney, placed his hand on his client's arm, silencing him. There was no strategic advantage to continuing. Cole had essentially confessed to every element of the crime. "My client will cooperate in locating the victim's remains," Finch stated formally. "However, I'm advising him to cease all further statements without consulting with me." Detective left the interrogation room feeling emotionally drained. He'd interrogated violent criminals before, but there was something uniquely disturbing about Cole's complete absence of human empathy. Cole wasn't insane in the legal sense. He understood right and wrong, understood that killing was wrong. But he was profoundly, fundamentally broken on some level deeper than mere mental illness. He was a predator who had convinced himself that his victim bore responsibility for her own death. That evening, sat in his car in the police station parking lot, wrestling with the weight of everything that had occurred. An innocent man had spent weeks in jail. An innocent man's reputation had been shattered. A real killer had nearly escaped justice because of investigative tunnel vision. A 3-year-old girl had been traumatized by witnessing violence, and that same trauma had inadvertently led to the truth. Understood that he needed to make things right. Not completely. Nothing could undo the damage already done, but he could at least ensure that Daniel Richardson received a full apology and that Cole faced maximum accountability for his crime. As the sun set over Tucson, Detective made the decision that would define the rest of his career. He would personally ensure that every detail of this case was handled with absolute integrity moving forward. The families deserved nothing less. Justice deserved nothing less. And perhaps, through comprehensive accountability and transparency, some small measure of redemption could be salvaged from this tragedy. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Sonoran Desert as the recovery team assembled at the coordinates Cole had provided during his confession. This wasn't a high-profile archaeological expedition or a celebrated discovery. Instead, it was a somber, necessary mission to bring Emma Richardson home, to provide her family with the finality and closure that they'd been desperately seeking for nearly 4 months. Detectives stood at the perimeter of the site, observing the specialized team preparing their equipment. There were forensic anthropologists, mine safety experts, search and rescue personnel, and evidence technicians. Each individual understood the gravity of their task. This wasn't simply about recovering remains. It was about honoring a victim, about providing evidence that would ensure a conviction, about allowing a family to finally grieve with certainty rather than agonizing hope. The abandoned mine shaft had been left to decay for over 40 years, ever since copper mining operations had ceased in the region. It was a dangerous location, unstable support structures, potential for cave-ins, toxic gases that could have accumulated in enclosed spaces. The recovery team had spent the previous day assessing the site's structural integrity, installing safety equipment, and planning the optimal descent route. Doctor, the lead forensic anthropologist, approached with a clipboard containing their detailed recovery plan. She was a woman in her 50s with decades of experience recovering remains in challenging environments, including crime scenes, natural disasters, and mass graves. Her expertise would be crucial in navigating this delicate process. "We're ready to begin," Doctor said, her voice professional but compassionate. According to Cole's statement, the remains should be approximately 75 feet into the shaft, positioned in a specific alcove. We've identified the location using ground-penetrating radar. The descent will take approximately 3 hours, and we estimate the full recovery will require an additional 4 to 6 hours. Nodded, understanding the meticulous nature of forensic recovery. This wasn't a simple retrieval operation. Each artifact, each bone fragment, each piece of clothing or evidence had to be carefully documented, photographed, and preserved to maintain chain of custody and ensure that evidence would be admissible in court. At 8:30 a.m., the first team member, wearing specialized safety equipment, began descending into the mine shaft. The rope system was secured to metal anchors driven deep into bedrock. Below, portable lighting systems illuminated the darkness, creating an eerie glow within the subterranean passage. The air quality had been tested thoroughly. Toxic gas levels were present but manageable with respiratory protection. Watched from the surface, unable to descend himself due to his bad knee from an injury sustained years ago. Instead, he monitored the operation through radio communications with Doctor, who accompanied the team into the mine. "We're at the first checkpoint," came Doctor's voice through radio. "Approximately 30 feet down. Conditions are stable, proceeding to target location." 30 minutes passed. Stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the mine shaft entrance, his mind occupied with thoughts of Emma Richardson, her life, her accomplishments, the daughter she'd left behind, the family now waiting for confirmation of what they'd suspected for months. "We have visual confirmation." Doctor's voice came through the radio, her tone shifting subtly. "We've located remains matching the description provided by the suspect. Initiating photographic documentation and evidence collection protocol." What followed was a painstakingly slow process. Every bone fragment was photographed in. Each piece of clothing was documented with precise measurements. The surrounding soil was carefully excavated in grid patterns, sifted through screens to capture microscopic evidence. The decomposed remains were treated with the reverence and respect typically reserved for sacred ceremonies. By mid-afternoon on the first day, the team had successfully recovered the primary skeletal remains. The identification process began immediately. Forensic dentists compared dental records provided by Emma's dentist. DNA samples were extracted and sent to the laboratory for comparison with known family members. Within hours, the preliminary identification was made with near certainty. These were indeed the remains of Emma Richardson. The second and third days of recovery focused on collecting surrounding evidence. Items discovered near Emma's remains included fragments of the tarp that Cole had used to wrap her body, portions of her clothing, personal effects that had been in her possession when she died. Each item was carefully documented and as evidence. On the third day, as workers completed a final sweep of the immediate area, they discovered something that sent shivers through the recovery team. In a crevice approximately 10 feet from where Emma's remains had been positioned, lay a small object. When extracted carefully and cleaned, It was identified as a child's hair ribbon, pink with small white flowers, the type of ribbon that a 3-year-old girl might have worn in her hair. The significance of this discovery wasn't immediately apparent, but when forensic analysis confirmed that the ribbon contained Lily's DNA, the implication became clear. At some point during the events of that fateful evening, the ribbon had come into contact with Cole or the items he'd used to transport Emma's body. Perhaps during the struggle, perhaps when Cole had carried the wrapped body through the home, the ribbon had become detached from Lily's hair and transferred to the perpetrator. It was a haunting reminder that this crime hadn't occurred in isolation. A small child had been present, had witnessed unspeakable violence, had been left traumatized and alone in its aftermath. Sarah Richardson, Emma's sister, was of the identification and recovery. She sat in detective's office, tears streaming down her face, tears of grief, yes, but also tears of anguished relief. The uncertainty had ended. The liminal space between hope and despair had finally resolved into the painful clarity of confirmed loss. "We found something that belonged to Lily," said gently, showing her the photograph of the recovered ribbon. "We're confident we can locate her complete recovery, and I want you to know that this evidence confirms that Lily was present during the incident. It validates her account of what happened." Sarah's hand trembled as she held the photograph. The ribbon was a tangible connection to her sister, a physical piece of evidence that Lily had indeed witnessed something traumatic, that her testimony, those 2 words spoken in fear, had been authentic and crucial. Emma Richardson's body was released for funeral arrangements after the initial autopsy was completed. The medical examiner's report confirmed understanding of events. Emma had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with striking a hard surface after being struck by another person. The injuries were consistent with Cole's confession. There was no evidence of sexual assault. The motivation for the crime was rage, not sexual violence, though Cole's obsession with Emma had provided the emotional foundation for that rage. The funeral service was held on a cold January morning, exactly 4 months after Emma's disappearance. The church was filled to capacity. Family members, friends, colleagues from Emma's workplace, neighbors, teachers from Lily's preschool, and surprisingly, community members who had followed the case in the news. Even detective attended, sitting in the back of the church, bearing witness to the impact of his investigative failures and the tragedy they'd been designed to solve. Lily, dressed in a black dress that seemed far too mature for her small frame, sat in the front pew with Sarah. The little girl didn't fully understand what was happening, though she grasped that something was profoundly wrong. She held tightly to Sarah's hand, occasionally asking softly, "Where's Mommy?" Each time, Sarah would pull her close and whisper, "Mommy is in heaven now, sweetheart. She's with the angels." As the service concluded, and Emma's casket was carried out of the church, felt the crushing weight of responsibility. An innocent man had been imprisoned, a real killer had nearly escaped justice, and a family had been shattered by violence that should have been prevented had the investigation been conducted with greater diligence and less assumption. Later that evening at the cemetery, Emma's remains were committed to the earth. The graveside service was smaller, just family members and close friends. As dirt was thrown onto the coffin, Sarah knelt beside Lily, helping her place a single white rose on the casket. The little girl's face was stoic, not yet fully capable of comprehending the permanence of death. Detective stood apart, observing the mourning family, understanding that while this recovery provided some closure, nothing could restore what had been lost. Emma Richardson was gone forever. Her daughter would grow up without her mother's presence. And though Cole would spend his remaining years in prison, that consequence was inadequate compensation for the life that had been stolen. The courthouse in downtown Tucson was packed to capacity on the day Cole's sentencing hearing commenced. Media outlets had provided extensive coverage throughout the trial, transforming what might have been a regional story into a nationally recognized case. The reason was clear. This case challenged fundamental assumptions about criminal justice, investigative integrity, and the reliability of eyewitness testimony, particularly testimony from young children. Cole stood before Judge, his expression remaining characteristically emotionless despite facing a sentence that would effectively end his life outside of prison. Cole had pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, avoiding a trial that would have traumatized Lily further and subjected her to cross-examination by defense counsel. The prosecution had agreed to the plea in exchange for Cole's cooperation in locating Emma's remains, which had already been accomplished. "Mr. Cole, before I pronounce sentence, do you have anything to say to this court?" Judge asked, her voice carrying the gravity of the moment. Cole stood slowly, his attorney placing a restraining hand on his shoulder, a gesture Cole ignored. For the first time in the entire proceedings, something shifted in Cole's demeanor. His face remained calm, but his eyes reflected something darker, a glimpse into the void behind his human facade. "I have nothing to say," Cole stated flatly. "I did what I did. I'm not sorry. Emma Richardson made choices that led to her death. I'm simply the instrument of those consequences." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even hardened court observers and journalists were struck by the brazen lack of remorse. Judge's expression hardened. "Your arrogance is noted, Mr. Cole," she said coldly, "and it reinforces my belief that this sentence is entirely appropriate and necessary. You are hereby sentenced to 45 years to life in prison. You will be eligible for parole consideration after 45 years, at which time you will be 90 years old. Given your age and criminal history, parole is highly unlikely. You will serve your sentence at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence. May God have mercy on your soul." The gavel came down with a finality that seemed to echo through the courtroom. Cole was led away by correctional officers, his face remaining impassive as he walked out of the courtroom toward a cell that would be his home for the remainder of his life. However, while Cole's immediate justice had been served, the case had far more complex ramifications. Daniel Richardson's wrongful imprisonment had created legal and ethical complications that the Tucson Police Department and District Attorney's Office were forced to confront directly. Within days of Cole's conviction, Daniel Richardson was formally exonerated. All charges against him were dismissed with prejudice, meaning he could never be tried again for the crime. The Tucson Police Department issued a formal statement acknowledging investigative errors, apologizing to Mr. Richardson, and announcing internal reforms designed to prevent similar miscarriages of justice. Detective faced an internal investigation regarding his conduct during the initial stages of the investigation. The review examined whether his actions constituted criminal negligence or simple investigative error. The conclusion was nuanced, had violated no laws, and had followed standard investigative protocols in focusing on the primary suspect in a domestic abuse case. However, the investigation also found that had allowed confirmation bias to narrow his investigative vision, that he had failed to adequately pursue alternative suspects, and that he had prematurely closed investigative avenues that might have led to Cole sooner. The consequences were multifaceted. He was required to complete specialized training in investigative bias, interrogation techniques, and child interview protocols. He was placed on administrative leave for 1 month. Most significantly, his reputation within the department shifted from decorated veteran to cautionary tale about the dangers of investigative tunnel vision. However, was not terminated. The investigation concluded that his errors, while serious, did not constitute willful misconduct or criminal behavior. Additionally, Slater's decision to pursue the unconventional approach with Max the police dog, the decision that ultimately cracked the case open, demonstrated his willingness to reconsider his initial assumptions when confronted with contradictory evidence. Detective accepted his punishment with quiet dignity. He understood that he'd nearly convicted an innocent man, and no administrative action could fully compensate for that near catastrophe. He committed himself to becoming an advocate for investigative reform, participating in training seminars at police academies throughout Arizona, discussing the dangers of confirmation bias, and emphasizing the importance of pursuing multiple investigative theories. Daniel Richardson pursued a civil lawsuit against the Tucson Police Department for wrongful prosecution and violation of his civil rights. The case settled for $2.7 million, a substantial sum designed to compensate for lost wages, emotional distress, damage to reputation, and psychological counseling required to process his traumatic experience. For Daniel, the monetary compensation provided practical assistance, but it couldn't restore what had been lost. He'd spent weeks in jail awaiting trial. His reputation had been shattered in his community. His relationship with Lily had been complicated by the cloud of suspicion that hung over him, even after exoneration. Many people who had read the initial news coverage never learned of his exoneration. In their minds, he remained a suspect, a man associated with violence and criminality. Nevertheless, Daniel attempted to rebuild his life. He secured employment at a manufacturing firm in Phoenix, relocating to escape the notoriety of his. He attended therapy to process the trauma of false accusation and imprisonment. He advocated for criminal justice reform, becoming a spokesperson for the National Registry of Exonerations, sharing his story with legal professionals, journalists, and the general public. Most importantly, Daniel worked to rebuild his relationship with Lily. The little girl had witnessed her mother's death and subsequently watched her father imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. The psychological complexity of Lily's experience required intensive therapeutic intervention with child specialists trained in trauma recovery. Dr. Hayes continued working with Lily throughout the legal proceedings and beyond. The little girl gradually began processing her trauma, though the scars remained deep and lasting. Lily would carry the emotional weight of these events for the rest of her life, not because she was broken, but because she had witnessed something fundamentally broken in the world. By age 5, Lily had begun to stabilize emotionally. She attended kindergarten, made friends, participated in normal childhood activities, but she remained cautious with strangers, hypervigilant to potential danger, and occasionally prone to anxiety responses triggered by unexpected stimuli. These were normal responses to abnormal trauma, manageable through continued therapeutic support. Detective established a scholarship in Emma Richardson's name, funded through his own modest retirement savings, and supplemented by donations from community members. The scholarship was designed to support single mothers pursuing higher education, honoring Emma's memory through concrete support for women in vulnerable circumstances. The Tucson Police Department implemented comprehensive reforms based on the Richardson case. New protocols were established for investigating domestic violence cases, emphasizing the importance of pursuing alternative suspects even when a primary suspect seemed obvious. Training programs were expanded to address investigative bias and confirmation bias. The department established a devil's advocate system for major investigations, designating specific personnel to actively seek contradictory evidence and alternative theories. Most significantly, the department's approach to involving child witnesses in investigations was overhauled. Specialized training was provided to officers and detectives regarding trauma-informed interviewing of young children. The controversial use of police dogs as therapeutic intermediaries was formally studied, and while not universally adopted, the technique was recognized as a potentially valuable intervention under specific circumstances with proper psychological oversight. The case became a standard teaching tool in law enforcement academies throughout the western United States. It was presented as a cautionary tale about investigative assumptions, but also as an example of how persistence and willingness to reconsider initial conclusions could ultimately lead to truth and justice. On the third anniversary of Emma Richardson's death, Detective attended a community memorial service organized by the Richardson family. Daniel Richardson spoke about his sister, his niece, and the long journey toward healing and justice. Sarah spoke about the challenges of supporting a traumatized child while grief consumed her own emotional resources. And Lily, now 6 years old, read a simple, carefully prepared statement about her mother, her favorite color, her favorite song, the way she laughed. As listened to these words, he felt something shift inside him. The guilt that had haunted him for 3 years didn't disappear. It would likely never disappear completely. But it transformed into something more constructive, a commitment to ensuring that his investigative failures had not been in vain, that the lessons learned from this tragedy would prevent similar miscarriages of justice. The case of Emma Richardson's murder, Lily's courage, and Daniel Richardson's wrongful imprisonment became a turning point in Arizona's criminal justice system. While no case could ever be perfect, and while complete prevention of injustice was impossible, the Richardson case demonstrated that awareness, accountability, and systematic reform could work together to protect the innocent, to ensure that the guilty faced appropriate consequences, and to honor victims by honoring the integrity of the investigative process itself. Justice, had learned, wasn't simply about securing convictions. True justice required humility, accountability, and the willingness to admit error and transform that error into wisdom. Emma Richardson remained gone, her life stolen by violence, but her death had inadvertently created the conditions for systemic improvement that would protect future generations from similar tragedies and similar miscarriages of justice.